By sunrise, the coldest rancher in Bitter Creek would be standing in his own kitchen with no hat in his hands, no anger in his mouth, and no words left for the woman the whole town had thrown away. Nora Bell Harlan heard the church door close behind her like the end of a sentence. A sack of flour sat at her feet, a basket of potatoes leaned against her skirt, and the women of the Ladies' Aid stood on the back steps pretending they had done something charitable. Mrs. Abigail Pike held out a folded note with 2 fingers, as if kindness itself might soil her gloves. "Whitaker Ranch is 9 miles west," she said. 3 children. No cook. You'll make supper, keep the kitchen orderly, and be gone by morning. Nora took the note without lowering her eyes. The wind pushed at her gray dress, pulled at the loose strands of hair beneath her bonnet, and carried the soft little whispers she was not meant to hear. Too big for a decent kitchen. Too plain for a decent man. A burden with an apron. Nora bent, lifted the flour, and set it in the wagon herself. No one offered to help. That was all right. She had learned long ago that a woman could survive a great deal if she did not waste breath-begging hands that were already folded against her. The wagon ride west was cold and quiet. The driver never asked her name. Snow lay thin over the Wyoming grass, not enough to bury the ruts, just enough to make the whole world look tired. By the time the dark shape of Whitaker Ranch rose against the dusk, Nora's fingers were stiff around the basket handle and her stomach had gone hollow from a day without food. Then she heard the sound from inside the house. Not one child crying. 3 different sorrows tangled under one roof. A little girl sobbing in hiccups, a boy shouting that he was not hungry, and somewhere above them, a silence so heavy it seemed louder than both. The kitchen door stood open, banging softly in the wind. Smoke had blackened the ceiling over the stove. A pot sat ruined on the iron, and a broken plate lay near the table beside a crust of bread too hard for even a dog to want. Nora stepped down from the wagon and picked up the flour before anyone could tell her to leave it. That was when Caleb Whitaker appeared in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and still as a fence post in winter, with eyes the color of river ice and a face that looked as if it had forgotten how to welcome anything. He glanced once at Nora, once at the flour, and did not move aside. "I didn't ask for a woman," he said. Nora looked past him into the dead kitchen, where a small blonde girl clutched a faded blue dress to her chest. A boy of 6 glared from under the table, and an older girl stood on the stairs without making a sound. Nora swallowed the ache in her throat and lifted the basket higher. "No, sir," she said softly. "You asked for someone who could cook." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You get one night. Then I'd best start before the children forget what warm food smells like." The boy under the table kicked a tin cup across the floor. It spun, rang once against Nora's boot, and went still. "We don't want her," he snapped. Nora looked down at the cup, then at the child's angry, hungry face. She did not scold him. She only picked it up, set it on the table, and said, "That's all right. Supper doesn't need to be wanted before it does its job." For the first time since she had arrived, the silent girl on the stairs blinked. Caleb Whitaker stepped aside only far enough for Nora to pass, and the moment she crossed the threshold, he shut the kitchen door against the wind as if he were sealing her inside a trial. The house smelled of smoke, old grief, and milk gone sour. Nora set the flour on the table, placed the potatoes beside it, and waited. She had learned that men like Caleb Whitaker trusted silence more than questions, so she gave him silence first. He pointed toward the stove. "That is yours until morning." Then he pointed toward the children, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "They are not." The boy under the table gave a short, bitter laugh. The little one with the blue dress pressed her face into the faded cloth. The oldest girl on the stairs kept both hands on the railing, pale fingers curled tight around the wood. "You do not touch them unless I tell you," Caleb said. "You do not ask them about their mother. You do not move her things. You do not sleep in her chair. You cook, you clean what you use, and when daylight comes, I will have Gideon drive you back to town." Nora untied her bonnet slowly. "Back to town is not where they mean for me to go." Caleb looked at her then, truly looked, but only for a second. "That is not my business." "No, sir." She folded the bonnet over her arm. "Hungry children are." His mouth tightened, though whether from anger or the truth of it, Nora could not tell. "Lily is 9, he said, nodding toward the stairs. "She has not spoken in nearly 2 years. Thomas is 6. He will not eat anything set before him unless he thinks he stole it. Grace is 4. She sleeps 2 hours on a good night and wakes calling for a woman who is not coming back." The kitchen seemed to grow smaller around those words. Nora did not look at the empty chair by the window. She did not need to. Every house carried its dead in a different place. This one had chosen the kitchen. "What did they eat today?" she asked. Caleb's eyes sharpened. "Bread. Only bread. And milk." "Was it warm?" He said nothing. That answer was plain enough. Nora rolled up her sleeves and moved to the wash basin. The water was cold enough to ache, but she scrubbed her hands anyway, then dried them on her own apron because the towel by the stove was stiff with old use. Thomas crawled halfway out from beneath the table. "Your biscuits will be bad," he said. "Maybe." Nora opened the flour sack. "Your stew will taste like dishwater. Then you had better complain loud enough for me to improve it." His eyes narrowed, suspicious of her calm. Grace lifted her head from the blue dress. "Are you the new mama?" The question landed harder than any insult from town. Caleb took one step forward. "Grace." Nora kept her hands in the flour and her voice gentle. "No, sweetheart. I would never take a name that already belongs to somebody loved." The little girl studied her. Lily's fingers loosened on the railing. Caleb looked away first. "Supper in 1 hour," he said. Nora glanced at the cold stove, the spoiled pot, the empty shelves, the 3 wounded children, and the man pretending he had not just handed her the broken heart of his house. "Then I need kindling, clean water, and 1 sharp knife." Thomas pointed toward the pantry before he remembered he was supposed to hate her. Nora found the pantry by following Thomas's reluctant finger and discovered what kind of winter the Whitaker house had been living through. A half sack of cornmeal. For soft potatoes with eyes growing from them. Dried beans in a coffee tin. Salt pork wrapped in cloth. A jar of apple butter pushed far to the back, its lid tied with faded ribbon, as if someone had hidden sweetness where grief could not find it. She did not touch the jar at first. Some things in a house had to be asked permission from, even when nobody living knew how to give it. She took the potatoes, the beans, and the salt pork, then turned to find Thomas standing in the pantry door with his arms folded. "That is not enough," he said. "It will be if we treat it kindly. Food does not care if you are kind." Nora set the potatoes in her apron. "No, but children do." His face changed so quickly she might have missed it if she had not been watching. Anger came back like a door slammed shut. "I am not a child." "Then you can help carry water like a man." He stared at her, caught between insult and invitation. Caleb, still by the kitchen door, gave no order. Nora waited. At last Thomas grabbed the empty pail and dragged it outside with more noise than necessary. Nora hid the smallest smile in the fold of her apron. Work was safer than comfort for boys who had forgotten how to be little. She cleaned the ruined pot without complaint, scraping the scorched bottom until her hands reddened in the cold water. Grace watched from her chair, the blue dress still tucked under her chin. Lily stayed halfway up the stairs, silent as moonlight. Caleb brought in kindling and laid it beside the stove. He did not speak. Nora did not thank him too warmly. A man that guarded might bolt from tenderness like a horse from thunder. She simply nodded once and struck a match. The flame caught slowly, then stronger, licking beneath the iron until the kitchen began to breathe. When Thomas returned, water sloshing over his boots, he set the pail down hard enough to splash her skirt. "Careful," Caleb warned. Nora lifted one hand before the rancher could say more. "No harm done." Thomas looked disappointed. That was when the testing began. He hid the sharp knife under the flour sack. Nora used a smaller one. He dropped too much salt near the pot and waited for her to scold him. She took a clean spoon, measured what she needed, and moved the salt to the far side of the table. He rolled a potato under the stove. She knelt, reached for it, wiped it on her apron, and cut away the bad spot. "You missed one," he said. "So I did," she answered. "Good thing you are watching close." Grace made a tiny sound that was almost a laugh, then buried it in the blue dress, as if laughter might be forbidden in that house. Caleb heard it. His hand tightened around the coffee cup he had not touched. Nora worked steady. Chop, rinse, stir, knead. Beans into water. Pork into the pan. Potatoes cut small so little mouths would not have to fight them. Cornmeal mixed with flour for quick biscuits, not pretty ones, but warm ones. She found a pinch of dried sage hanging near the window and added it carefully. The smell rose slowly, filling corners that had forgotten supper could be more than duty. Thomas stopped moving, his eyes fixed on the pot. Nora pretended not to notice. "It smells wrong," he muttered. "Maybe. Mama used sage." The kitchen went still. Caleb looked up sharply. Grace's fingers froze on the blue dress. Lily leaned one step lower on the stairs. Thomas seemed to hear what he had said only after it was loose in the room. His face flushed. "I do not care." Nora stirred once, gently. "Sage is a good herb to remember someone by." He swallowed. "You do not know anything about her." "No," Nora said. "But I know she fed you." Thomas turned away, but not before she saw his mouth tremble. Caleb set his cup down without drinking. Nora rolled the biscuit dough and cut it with the rim of a tin cup, then pressed one small star shape with her fingers for Grace, because the child had not blinked. In nearly a minute. "That one is too little," Thomas said. "Little things still count." Grace reached out, almost touching the dough, then pulled back. Nora slid the tray toward the stove. While her back was turned, Thomas crept to the pot, lifted the spoon, and tasted the stew. He froze. The spoon stayed in his hand. His shoulders, sharp with defiance all evening, lowered by the smallest inch. Caleb saw it from the doorway. Nora saw Caleb seeing it. Nobody said a word, because the wrong word would break the spell. Then Thomas whispered, not to Nora and not quite to anyone. "She made it like this when the snow came." The fire popped softly. Lily came down one more stair. Nora set supper on the table as if she were laying down something fragile. 3 bowls first, because children needed to be served before pride. Then one for Caleb, though he stood with his shoulder against the doorframe like a man who had no intention of coming closer. The stew was thin, but it steamed. The biscuits were uneven, but they were hot. The apple butter jar sat unopened near Nora's elbow, its faded ribbon still tied around the lid. Thomas climbed into his chair without being told, then seemed angry with himself for doing it. Grace sat beside him, the blue dress folded in her lap like a sleeping cat. Lily had come all the way down the stairs, but she stopped behind the empty chair by the window. No one had moved that chair to the table. No one had sat in it. No one had spoken its name. Nora placed the smallest biscuit on Grace's plate, the one she had shaped like a star, and the little girl touched it with one finger. "It is crooked," Thomas said. "Most stars are, if you look close enough," Nora answered. He scowled, but he picked up his spoon. Caleb saw it. Nora saw Caleb seeing it, and still she kept her eyes on the table instead of on the man. Some miracles were shy things. They ran if stared at. Thomas took one bite, then another, each spoonful slower than the last. He was trying to pretend he was only testing it, but hunger had already betrayed him. His shoulders dropped. His boots stopped kicking the chair leg. Grace watched him for permission, then dipped her spoon into her own bowl. The stew touched her mouth. She blinked. Then she ate again. Caleb pushed away from the doorframe. The floorboard gave a soft creak beneath his boot, and both younger children looked up as if they expected the sound to turn into a command. He said nothing. That seemed to confuse them more than anger would have. Nora poured a little water into Grace's cup and set it close enough for small hands to reach. "Slow now," she said. "Warm food does better when it is welcomed, not chased." Thomas looked at her over his bowl. "You talk to food like it can hear you. Sometimes it is the only thing in a house that listens." The words slipped out softer than she meant them to. Caleb's face changed, not much, just enough that the hard line of his mouth faltered. Then Lily moved. She came around the table, silent in her black dress, and stood before the place where her mother should have been. Her own bowl remained untouched. Nora waited. Caleb straightened. "Lily," he said, low and careful. The girl did not answer. She looked at the biscuits, then at the empty chair, then at Nora with eyes too old for 9 years. Nora understood before anyone else did. She took the plainest biscuit, the one brown too dark on one side, and placed it on a small plate. Then she slid the plate toward the empty chair. "For whoever is still loved here," she said. The room went so quiet the fire sounded loud. Caleb's eyes turned cold in an instant. "Miss Harlan." The warning in his voice was sharp enough to stop most people. Nora folded her hands in front of her apron and lowered her gaze, not in fear, but in respect. "I meant no harm, Mr. Whitaker. You do not know what you meant." His voice roughened. "You have been in this house less than 2 hours." Thomas stopped eating. Grace's lip trembled. Lily stared at the biscuit on the empty plate. Nora did not defend herself. She did not explain grief to a man still standing inside it. She only stepped back from the table. Caleb took one step toward her, then stopped because Lily had reached for the biscuit. Not to eat it. She broke it in half with both hands, carried one piece to Grace, and placed the other beside Thomas's bowl. Grace accepted it with wide eyes. Thomas looked down at the piece in front of him as if his sister had handed him something holy. Caleb's hand found the back of the nearest chair. His fingers closed around the wood until the knuckles went pale. Lily returned to the empty chair, touched the plate once, then sat down at her own place and lifted her spoon. She did not smile. She did not speak. But she ate. Nora turned toward the stove before anyone could see her eyes fill. Behind her, Caleb stood motionless, and when his coffee cup rattled softly against the table, no one mentioned that the cold rancher's hand had started to shake. After supper, the children did not leave the table all at once. That was what made the room feel strange to Caleb. For almost 2 years, meals had ended like weather breaking apart, Thomas vanishing angry, Grace crying herself tired, Lily drifting back upstairs with her silence trailing behind her. But that night Thomas stayed to scrape the last of the stew from his bowl. Grace leaned against the chair with the star biscuit held carefully in both hands, too sleepy to eat it and too afraid someone might take it. Lily sat with her spoon resting beside an empty bowl, her eyes fixed on the plate Nora had set near the empty chair. Nora did not touch that plate again. She cleared the rest quietly, one dish at a time, moving with the careful calm of a woman who knew when not to disturb a house that had just taken its first breath. Caleb watched from the stove. He had meant to send her back at sunrise. He had meant to keep his house closed, his rules hard, and his children safe from any softness that might leave them worse off when it disappeared. But Thomas had eaten. Grace had nearly smiled. Lily had put food in her mouth without being begged, ordered, or watched like a sick calf. Nora carried the bowls to the wash basin, rolled her sleeves, and began to clean. The water had gone lukewarm. She did not complain. Caleb noticed that first. Then he noticed the way she held her left wrist close to her body when she reached for the soap, as if even small movements had learned to be careful. A thin red mark circled the skin there, not fresh, but not forgotten either, the kind made by cheap twine tied too tight around bundles, or by work done too long with nobody caring how it was done. He stepped closer before he could stop himself. "Your wrist," he said. Nora pulled her sleeve down. "It is nothing." "I did not ask if it was nothing." She looked at him then, and for the first time since she had entered his kitchen, the steadiness in her eyes trembled. Not fear. Not exactly. More like a woman bracing for a familiar kind of weather. "Some marks come from carrying what folks hand you," she said. "Some come from what they say while you are carrying it." Caleb said nothing. Nora reached into her apron pocket for a rag, and a folded piece of paper slipped out, landing near his boot. She moved too quickly for it, but he was closer. He picked it up before thinking better of it. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, quiet and firm. "That is not yours." He should have handed it back. Instead, his eyes caught the writing before he could look away. "No man wants a woman built like a flour barrel. Let her cook where no decent family has to claim her." The words sat on the page mean and small, yet they filled the kitchen like smoke. Caleb folded the paper once slowly. He looked toward the table, where Thomas was pretending not to listen and Lily had gone very still. Grace had fallen asleep with her cheek against the blue dress. Who wrote this? He asked. Nora held out her hand. Does it matter? Yes. Not to the people who passed it around. Her voice did not break. That made it worse. People can call a woman anything when they are sure nobody will answer for her. Caleb placed the paper in her hand. His jaw worked once, but no words came. Nora tucked the note back into her apron, as if it were only another thing she had learned to carry. Then she turned to the basin again. Caleb went to the wood box, lifted 2 split logs, and fed them into the stove. It was not an apology. It was not enough. But the fire caught brighter and warmth pushed across the floor toward her skirts. Nora paused with one wet plate in her hand. Thank you, she said. Caleb kept his eyes on the flames. Kitchen was getting cold. Behind them, Grace made a small, broken sound in her sleep. Nora turned first. The child's face had gone flushed, her little hands restless around the blue dress. Thomas stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. Papa, he whispered. Caleb was already moving, but Nora reached Grace before him and laid the back of her hand against the child's forehead. Her expression changed, all softness leaving except the kind that knew what to do. She is burning hot, Nora said. Caleb's face drained of color. Upstairs, Lily took one silent step down. Nora did not wait for permission because fever did not wait for a father to decide whether pride mattered more than help. She lifted Grace from the chair with a care so steady that even Caleb stopped reaching for half a breath. The little girl was light in Nora's arms, too warm, her face pressed against the faded blue dress as if the cloth could pull her back toward someone gone. Boiled water, Nora said. Clean cloths. Not the stiff ones by the stove. Something soft. Caleb stared at her. Miss Harlan. Now, Mr. Whitaker. The command was quiet, but it moved him. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and pulled a clean towel from a high shelf Nora had not seen. Thomas stood frozen beside the table, his freckles pale under the lamplight. Is she going to die like Mama? The words came out small, smaller than any anger he had thrown all evening. Caleb turned as if the question had struck the air from him, but no answer came. Nora settled Grace on the settee near the stove, dipped a cloth into warm water, wrung it out, and laid it across the child's forehead. Then she looked straight at Thomas. Not while I am standing. The boy swallowed hard. You cannot promise that. No, Nora said. But I can work for it. That was enough to keep him from breaking. He dragged a stool close and sat with both fists on his knees, watching every move. Lily had come halfway down the stairs, one hand on the rail, eyes wide and shining in the dim light. Nora saw her, but did not call to her. Some children came closer only when nobody tugged. Grace stirred and whimpered. Caleb knelt beside the settee, his large hands hovering uselessly above his daughter, afraid to touch, afraid not to. She gets these spells, he said, voice rough. Since last winter. I ride for the doctor when I can, but by the time he comes, she is sleeping or worse from the waiting. Nora changed the cloth. How long since she ate well? Weeks. How long since she slept warm? Caleb looked toward the cold hallway, then back to the child. I keep fires. That is not what I asked. His mouth closed. The kitchen filled with small sounds, water dripping into the basin, fire taking the new logs, Thomas breathing too fast, Grace murmuring into the dress. Nora began to hum, not loudly, not sweetly enough to make a performance of it, just a low mountain tune her own grandmother had sung over bread dough and storm nights. Grace's fingers loosened. Caleb looked at Nora as if the sound had opened a door he had boarded shut. What song is that? One for children who are trying to find their way back to sleep. My wife sang. He stopped. The rest of the sentence stayed in his throat. Nora did not chase it. Then Grace already knows how to follow a song. The little girl turned her face toward Nora's apron. Her hot hand reached blindly, found the cloth, and held on. Caleb moved at once. Grace, let Miss Harlan work. Grace's fingers tightened. Her eyes opened only a slit. No, she whispered. Do not make her go. Thomas made a sound and covered his mouth. Caleb went still from his boots to his shoulders. The words were barely more than breath, but they crossed the room and settled into every corner. Nora's hand paused over the child's hair. "I am right here, sweetheart. Stay till morning?" Grace asked. Nora glanced at Caleb. He looked down at his daughter, then at the apron caught in her fist. The rule he had made at the door seemed a foolish, brittle thing now. "Till morning," he said. Nora nodded once and kept cooling Grace's forehead. The hours stretched. Thomas fetched water without being asked. Caleb fed the stove. Lily came down one stair, then another, until she stood behind Nora's chair with the faded blue dress in her hands. Near dawn, Grace's fever eased. Her breathing softened. She slept with her cheek against Nora's lap, one hand still wrapped in the apron. Thomas folded himself on the rug and closed his eyes for the first time all night. Caleb stood by the window, gray light touching the lines of his face. Then Lily stepped forward, laid the blue dress gently over Grace's feet, and placed one silent hand on Nora's shoulder. The first wagon came up the ranch road just after the sun cleared the low Wyoming hills. Nora heard the wheels before she saw them, a dry grinding sound over frozen ruts, too sharp for morning and too certain for a friendly visit. Grace was still asleep with the blue dress over her feet. Thomas lifted his head from the rug. Lily's hand slipped from Nora's shoulder, but the girl did not run back upstairs. Caleb stood at the window and watched the wagon roll through the open gate, his face returning to that hard winter stillness Nora had met at the door. "Who is it?" Thomas asked. Caleb did not answer at first. A second wagon appeared behind the first, then two riders. Nora recognized Mrs. Abigail Pike before the horses stopped. The woman sat upright as a church steeple, black gloves folded around a small handbag, her bonnet pinned so tight it looked like judgment had dressed itself for breakfast. Beside her sat Silas Pike, broad-faced and smiling in a way that had never once meant kindness. Nora rose carefully, easing Grace's hand from her apron. The little girl stirred, found the cloth again, and held tight even in sleep. Nora looked down at her, then at Caleb. "They came for me." Caleb turned from the window. "Did you know they would? People like Mrs. Pike do not send a woman away unless they mean to make sure she stays gone." Thomas stood. "She cannot leave. Grace is sick." Nora touched his shoulder with two fingers, light enough that he could step away if he wished. He did not. "Hush now." Outside, boots sounded on the porch. Caleb opened the door before anyone knocked. Cold morning air pushed into the kitchen, but this time the house did not feel empty enough to welcome it. Mrs. Pike looked past Caleb at Nora, then at the children, then at the dishes. Stacked clean by the basin. Her mouth tightened. "Mr. Whitaker, we expected Miss Harlan to be ready by daylight." Caleb's voice stayed flat. "Morning is not over." Silas stepped around his mother and grinned at Nora. "Well now, look at that." The stray found the warmest corner. Nora folded her hands over her apron. The note in her pocket seemed to burn against her hip. "Good morning, Mr. Pike." "Do not good morning me. Town paid Gideon to haul you here. Town will see you hauled out." Thomas moved closer to Nora's skirt. "She fed us." Silas laughed under his breath. "Fed you once, boy. That does not make her family." Grace woke at the sound, blinking with fever-dulled eyes. She saw the strangers and reached both arms toward Nora. Nora bent at once, gathering her close. Mrs. Pike made a disapproving sound. "That is exactly what concerns us. A woman like her can confuse children who have already suffered enough." Caleb's hand closed on the door edge. "A woman like her?" Mrs. Pike lifted her chin. "You know what I mean. No husband. No standing. No proper home. No suitable appearance for a man raising daughters. Folks will talk if she remains under your roof." Lily stood behind Nora, silent but listening. Nora felt that silence like a hand between her shoulder blades, asking her not to shrink. Silas took one step into the kitchen without being invited. "Come on, Nora Bell. You had your night by the stove. Do not make decent people beg." Nora did not move. Grace's arms tightened around her neck. Thomas grabbed the wooden spoon from the table and held it like a flag, not a weapon, just something he could claim. "She is not going," he said. Mrs. Pike's eyes flashed. "Mr. Whitaker, control your son." Caleb looked at Thomas, then at Grace in Nora's arms, then at Lily, who had come close enough to touch the torn edge of Nora's apron. For one long second, he said nothing, and that silence cut Nora deeper than Silas's smile. She nodded once, swallowing what hurt. "I will gather my things." She shifted Grace gently, but the child cried out, "No!" Silas reached for the apron string as if to hurry her along. The cloth gave a sharp tear. Nora froze. The room froze with her. Caleb stepped down from the doorway, and the floorboard answered under his boot. Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sound of his boot on the kitchen floor was enough to make Silas Pike turn his head, and something in the room shifted with that single movement. Grace clung to Nora's neck. Thomas stood with the wooden spoon in both hands, his small face white but steady. Lily's fingers tightened around the torn edge of Nora's apron, and for the first time since Caleb had opened his door the night before, Nora saw the rancher look not like a man guarding a house from strangers, but like a father realizing who had been standing inside it all along. "Let go of her apron," Caleb said. Silas smiled, but his hand dropped. "Easy now, Whitaker. We are only collecting what town charity delivered." Caleb stepped between him and Nora. "She is not a parcel." Mrs. Pike made a sharp little breath through her nose. "No one said she was." "You said enough." Caleb's voice stayed low, each word laid down like a fence post driven deep. "You brought her here with flour and potatoes and a note mean enough to shame a Christian woman twice over. You expected her to warm my stove, quiet my children, and vanish before daylight so nobody in Bitter Creek had to admit she was useful." Mrs. Pike's cheeks colored. "Mr. Whitaker, you are grieving. You are not thinking clearly." Caleb looked back once. Grace had buried her face against Nora's shoulder. Thomas had moved closer. Lily stood so near Nora that her sleeve brushed the torn apron string. "I have not thought this clearly in 2 years," he said. Silas gave a hard laugh and glanced toward the porch, where the riders waited. "All this over one supper? She is a cook, Caleb. A big woman with nowhere to go. Do not turn your children soft over a pan of stew." Nora flinched, but Caleb saw it. He saw the way she tried to hide the wound before it had even landed, the way she made herself smaller though there was nowhere left in the kitchen to disappear. His jaw tightened. He turned back to Silas. "Then hear me plain. No one touches my cook." The words struck the room silent. Even the horses outside seemed to stop shifting. Mrs. Pike blinked as if she had misheard. Silas's smile thinned. Caleb took another step, not close enough to threaten, only close enough that no one could pretend he was unsure. "No one shames the woman my children trust. No one drags warmth out of my house after it finally came back. No one stands in my kitchen and calls mercy a mistake." Nora could not move. The torn apron hung from her waist, Grace's little fingers tangled in the cloth, and Thomas's wooden spoon lowered slowly until it rested against his leg. Mrs. Pike looked toward the children, perhaps expecting them to deny it, perhaps expecting the old emptiness of the Whitaker house to answer for her. Instead, Thomas spoke first. "She made Grace sleep." His voice shook, but he did not stop. "She made supper. She did not yell when I ruined things. She put a biscuit for Mama." Mrs. Pike stiffened. "Thomas, grief has confused you." "No," Caleb said. "It has not." Grace lifted her head, cheeks still flushed from fever, and whispered, "She stayed." That was all. 2 little words. They did more than any argument. Nora pressed her lips together, but her eyes shone. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, not as the town's burden, not as a temporary cook, not as the woman he had meant to send away with the morning. He saw flour on her sleeve, weariness under her eyes, a torn apron, and the steady hands that had held his house through the longest night it had known. "Miss Harlan stays until she chooses otherwise," Caleb said. Mrs. Pike opened her mouth. Caleb reached for the door and held it wide. "And if Bitter Creek needs something to talk about, tell them Caleb Whitaker said this house finally sounded alive before sunrise." No one answered. Silas looked from Caleb to Nora, then to the children gathered around her, and whatever words he had brought with him seemed to dry up in his throat. One by one, the visitors stepped back onto the porch. The wagons turned in the yard. The riders followed. Only when the last wheel rolled through the gate did Caleb close the door. The kitchen remained silent. Then Lily let go of Nora's apron and walked around Caleb as if crossing a bridge no one else could. See. Lily crossed the kitchen slowly, her bare feet making almost no sound against the worn boards. Caleb did not move. Nora did not breathe. Thomas stood beside the table with the wooden spoon forgotten in his hand, and Grace, still warm and weak, lifted her head from Nora's shoulder as if even she understood that the whole house had leaned toward this moment. Lily stopped in front of Nora. For nearly 2 years, the child had carried her silence like a locked door, and everyone in that house had learned to walk around it. Caleb had begged once. Thomas had shouted at it. Grace had cried beside it. The silence had never opened. Lily looked first at the torn apron, then at Nora's flour-dusted sleeve, then at the place near the window where the empty chair waited with the biscuit plate still beside it. Her little throat moved. Caleb's hand tightened around his hat. Lily reached out and took Nora's hand. "Papa," she said, her voice thin and rough from disuse, "do not send her away." The words were so small they should have disappeared. Instead, they filled every corner of the kitchen. Caleb went white. Thomas dropped the wooden spoon, and it clattered on the floor loud enough to make Grace blink. Nora's eyes filled, but she did not pull Lily close too fast. She only bent to the child's height and held the hand that had chosen her. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. Lily looked frightened by the sound of her own voice, but she did not take the words back. She stepped closer until her forehead rested against Nora's apron, right beside the tear Silas had made. Caleb turned away for one breath, not because he wanted to hide from them, but because a man could stand against wagons, gossip, winter, and debt, and still be undone by his daughter speaking one sentence in his own kitchen. When he faced them again, his eyes were wet, though no tear fell. He removed his hat slowly. "Miss Harlan," he said. Nora looked up. She seemed ready for gratitude, ready for dismissal, ready for any careful kindness that still ended with her walking down the road alone. Caleb saw that readiness and hated every person who had taught it to her. "Breakfast is still needing made," he said, his voice low. "If you are willing." For a moment, Nora only stared at him. Then Grace lifted her head and murmured, "Stars again." Thomas wiped his sleeve across his face and said, "And stew, if there is any left." Lily did not speak again, but she did not have to. She kept hold of Nora's hand. A sound came from Nora then, not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "Breakfast first," she said. "Stew later. And star biscuits only if someone fetches water." Thomas was out the door before Caleb could move, boots half-laced and shoulders lighter than they had been the night before. Grace settled back against the settee, watching Nora as if she feared blinking might make her vanish. Lily followed Nora to the work table and stood beside her, quiet but no longer distant. Caleb went to the wood box, added the last clean logs, and opened the stove draft. Flame caught. Morning light slid through the kitchen window and touched flour, tin cups, 3 empty bowls waiting to be filled, and the empty chair that no longer seemed to accuse them. Nora tied the torn apron as best she could. Caleb noticed, crossed to the peg by the pantry, and took down a clean white apron that had not been used in years. He held it out, careful as a man offering something more than cloth. Nora looked at it, then at him. "Are you sure?" Caleb glanced at his children. Thomas came in with the water pail. Grace smiled sleepily. Lily reached for the apron ribbon and placed it in Nora's hand. Caleb's voice was rough but steady. "This house knows what it lost. That does not mean it cannot know what has come." Nora put on the apron. No one said it belonged to anyone else. No one needed to. By the time the biscuits browned, the kitchen smelled of coffee, butter, and firewood. Thomas set the table without being asked. Grace ate half a biscuit and fell asleep smiling. Lily carried the plate from the empty chair to the center of the table, not forgetting, only making room. Caleb stood in the doorway, hat in hand, watching the woman Bitter Creek had tried to throw away feed his children like she had been sent by mercy itself. He had meant to speak. He meant to thank her, to explain, to ask what she needed, to tell her she had a place under his roof as long as she